The parking lot behind the Rusty Spoon had never been a welcoming place on the first cold nights of autumn. Sickly yellow light bled across rain-streaked asphalt, and the distant hum of Chicago's engines only made the empty lot feel more desolate. The wind carried the sharp bite of Lake Michigan, cutting through the thin fabric of uniforms and cheap coats alike. Elara Vance pulled the collar of her jacket up beneath her chin, still holding the keys to her beat-up Honda, when the sharp crack of metal against concrete echoed from a dark corner beyond the row of parked vehicles. She stopped. A woman's voice came next, low, strangled with anger, followed by a smaller, pleading voice. Fragile. A thread about to snap. Elara's Omega instincts stirred beneath her skin, a primal hum that made her teeth ache. She'd been on suppressants for years, had trained herself to ignore the pull of her biology, but this was something different. Something that bypassed logic and went straight for the marrow of her bones. She looked toward the sound and saw the shadow of a larger figure pinning a smaller woman against the side of a sleek black sedan. One hand was locked around the smaller woman's wrist, and the alpha's entire body loomed over her like a collapsing wall. For one moment, Elara's whole body went rigid. It wasn't because of the cold. It was something deeper. Something old rising from the bottom of her heart, a blurred image of a small room long ago, of a tightly closed door, and the sound of muffled sobbing behind it. She wouldn't let herself remember anymore. She simply stood there, heart pounding, legs heavy as though they'd been buried in wet concrete. The old instinct inside her whispered to turn away. Do what so many others had once done. Pretend she hadn't heard anything. Walk to her car. Start the engine. Drive away as fast as she could. That would be the safe thing. That was what a poor Omega, 28 years old, with a young child waiting at home and no one to protect her, was supposed to do. Elara had already turned halfway around, fingers tightening around her keys. Then the smaller woman pleaded again. And this time, her voice sounded more broken, carrying a desperation Elara understood far too well. So well that it made her chest tighten. She thought of someone who had once cried out for help in the same way, on a night buried deep in the past. And no one had come. The thought struck her like a hand shoving hard against her back. Before she could weigh the risks or think about what she stood to lose, Elara turned around, let her keys fall to the ground, and strode toward the darkness. Hey, she shouted, her voice carrying further than she'd expected. Let her go. Right now. The alpha jerked her head around. Beneath the light, her face came into view, cold and dangerously handsome, with sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that still blazed with anger that hadn't begun to fade. Her scent hit Elara like a wall, cedar and smoke and something wild, something that made the Omega in her want to submit even as every rational part of her brain screamed to run. Her name was Sloane Marchetti, though Elara didn't know that yet. All Elara saw was an alpha doing the very thing she'd hated all her life. And that was more than enough. This is none of your business, Sloane said, her voice deep and threatening. Walk away before you regret it. I'm not going anywhere. Elara replied, though her knees were trembling. She's pregnant. Do you even understand what you're doing? The pregnant woman lifted her eyes to Elara. They were filled with tears and a silent, overwhelming terror. Her name was Isabella. Her lips moved as though she wanted to say something, perhaps a warning, perhaps a plea, but no sound came out. Sloane glared at Elara, then released her wife's wrist and turned fully toward the strange young woman who had dared to interfere. Who the hell do you think you are? She said through clenched teeth, stepping closer. Some little Omega thinks she can lecture me? Elara didn't retreat. She moved directly between Sloane and Isabella, stretching one arm behind her as though to shield the woman shrinking against the car. Her heart was screaming at her to be afraid, but something stronger than fear kept her feet planted firmly on the ground. "I'm nobody," she said, her voice soft but steady. "But I'm not going to stand here and watch." Something flickered in Sloane's eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Or confusion. Or both. She'd never met an Omega who looked her in the eye like this, who spoke to her without trembling, who dared to stand between an Alpha and what the Alpha believed was hers. "Get out of my way," Sloane growled, her Alpha command bleeding through her words, heavy with pheromones. Elara felt it, the weight of that voice, the biological pull to obey. Her Omega instincts howled at her to submit, to drop her gaze, to bare her throat. Years of suppressance and careful control had dulled the edge of those instincts, but they were still there, buried deep. She gritted her teeth and refused to move. "You want to hit someone tonight?" Elara said, breathing hard. "Then hit me. But you won't touch her again." Sloane's eyes widened. For a moment, the cruelty that had twisted her face earlier flickered, and something else emerged, something that looked almost like confusion. Like she'd never encountered resistance like this before. The Alpha's gaze swept across the parking lot as though she'd suddenly remembered that the place wasn't as private as she'd believed, then returned to Isabella with cold contempt. At that exact moment, Isabella let out a sudden cry of pain. She folded forward, clutching her stomach with both hands, her already pale face turning white as paper. She staggered against the side of the car, her knees gave way, and she began sliding toward the frozen ground. Elara spun around. Every part of her attention immediately shifted to the woman collapsing before her. She dropped to her knees beside Isabella, slipping one arm behind the trembling woman's back while her other hand pulled the old phone from her coat pocket. Her fingers moved quickly across the freezing screen, pressing 3 familiar numbers. After only 2 rings, a calm female voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Elara fought to keep her voice from breaking as she explained the situation. Pregnant woman. Severe pain. Parking lot behind the Rusty Spoon on Wells Street. Possible danger. The dispatcher asked several more questions, then told her that the nearest ambulance was already responding to another call and wouldn't reach them for nearly 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Elara heard those words and felt as though a block of ice had crashed down onto her chest. She looked at Isabella doubled over in agony, lips clenched so tightly they'd begun to bleed, beads of sweat gathering across her forehead despite the cold. 20 minutes might be too long. She lifted her head and searched for Sloane, but the Alpha had already backed several steps away, standing frozen in the darkness between 2 rows of cars. Something flickered in her eyes, somewhere between panic and calculation. She looked at her wife writhing on the ground, then at Elara, then toward the entrance of the parking lot, as though weighing whether she should run. For one brief moment, the cruelty that had twisted her face earlier was gone, leaving only the naked cowardice of an Alpha who felt powerful only when standing over someone weaker than herself. Then she turned sharply, strode into the darkness, and vanished. Elara didn't waste a second being angry. Strangely enough, Sloane's absence made her feel relieved, because now she had only one life to worry about, or rather, 2 lives, both of them resting in her hands. She leaned close to Isabella's ear and told her clearly that she wasn't going to wait for the ambulance, that she'd drive her to the hospital right now because Mercy West was only a few minutes away. Far faster than sitting there in the rain. Isabella gave a weak nod. Elara slipped an arm beneath hers, using every ounce of strength she had to help the pregnant woman to her feet. Step by step, they supported each other across the slick parking lot. Elara carried almost all of Isabella's weight across her shoulders, her worn shoes slipping several times on the wet pavement, nearly sending them both down. She opened the rear door of her old car, carefully lowered Isabella onto the seat, then hurriedly folded her own coat and placed it beneath the woman's head. Ilara rushed into the driver's seat, pushed the key into the ignition, and the aging engine coughed several times before finally turning over. The car pulled out of the parking lot and merged onto rain-slicked streets beneath Chicago's dim yellow streetlights. Ilara gripped the steering wheel, straining to see through the windshield as rain lashed across the glass, pressing the accelerator harder than she'd ever dared in her life. In the back seat, Isabella moaned softly with every contraction, and between broken breaths she began to plead, begged Ilara to save the baby, said she could endure anything, only please don't let her lose her child. Hearing those words, Ilara felt her throat close. She glanced into the rearview mirror at the pale face of the stranger behind her and spoke with a certainty she didn't truly feel, save your strength. Stop talking. We're almost there. She promised she'd get both mother and child to safety. Ilara didn't know where she found the confidence to make such a promise. But in that moment, she needed Isabella to believe it, and she needed to believe it herself. The next few minutes passed like a tense, feverish dream, filled with the squeak of windshield wipers, rain hammering against the roof, and the weakening breaths of the woman behind her. When the glowing sign of Mercy West Hospital finally appeared at the end of the street, Ilara nearly burst into tears from relief. She drove straight to the emergency entrance, slammed on the brakes, jumped from the car, and shouted for help. Within seconds, medical workers in uniform rushed outside with a stretcher, lifted Isabella from the car with swift, practiced movements, and placed her on the gurney. Ilara ran beside them until an arm stopped her at the threshold, and the double doors of the emergency department swung shut directly in front of her. She stepped back, sank onto a nearby plastic chair, and only then, when everything had finally grown quiet, did she realize that both her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and that her sleeves were stained with dirt and rainwater. Ilara sat motionless on the hard plastic chair for a length of time she could no longer measure, her eyes fixed on the double doors of the emergency department, listening to every hurried footstep echoing from inside. Time carried a weight of its own in a hospital. It moved with suffocating slowness, each passing minute stretching like a cord pulled so tight it was ready to snap. She clasped her hands together, now that they'd begun to stop trembling, and offered an awkward prayer for a woman whose name she hadn't even had the chance to ask. At last, the doors swung open, and a doctor in blue scrubs stepped into the hallway, pulling down her mask to reveal a face worn with exhaustion but grave with concern. She glanced along the empty corridor, and when she saw that Ilara was the only person waiting there in a wrinkled waitress uniform, she walked toward her. "Are you the one who brought the pregnant woman in?" Ilara sprang to her feet, nodded, and immediately asked whether the woman was all right and whether the baby was safe. The doctor released a long breath, then told her in a low voice that both mother and child had survived the crisis, but it had been a race against time. "If you'd arrived even 10 minutes later," she said plainly, "there's a very real chance we wouldn't have been able to save either of them." The words left Ilara completely still. She reached for the back of the chair as her legs seemed to soften beneath her, and a rush of warmth gathered painfully behind her eyes. 10 minutes. She'd stood on that fragile dividing line without ever realizing it. And it was her recklessness, her refusal to wait even 1 second longer, that had pulled 2 human lives back from the edge. The doctor added that the patient was now being monitored and needed rest, then excused herself and returned through the doors. Ilara remained alone in the hallway. When the first surge of emotion began to settle, another feeling slowly crept into her heart, the awareness that she didn't belong there. She'd done what needed to be done. The woman was safe. Now she should quietly leave, before anyone began asking questions, before trouble she couldn't afford found its way into her life. She had a young child waiting at home. A shift the next morning. An entire life already strained to its limits. She bent down to gather the soaking coat draped over her arm, pulled the worn strap of her handbag back onto her shoulder, and started toward the exit, her thin-soled shoes making soft scraping sounds against the polished tile floor. But she hadn't gone far when something beyond the hospital's glass doors caused the entire space to fall suddenly still. A long, imposing black sports utility vehicle glided to a stop in front of the emergency entrance with unmistakable purpose, its headlights sweeping a cold beam across the glass. Almost at once, the atmosphere in the hospital corridor changed. A nurse pushing a medication cart stopped moving. A security guard straightened his back. Even the people seated in the distant waiting area lifted their heads and looked outside with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The doors of the vehicle opened, and two broad-shouldered women in dark suits stepped out first, taking positions on either side with the bearing of women accustomed to clearing a path. Then a third woman emerged from the back seat. She was tall and powerfully built, dressed in a black suit tailored to fit every line of her body. Her stride was slow but commanding, neither hurried nor hesitant. She pushed through the glass doors and entered, and as though some invisible order had passed through the air, everyone standing along the walkway instinctively moved aside to let her through. There were no shouted commands, no spoken instructions. Only a heavy silence wrapped around her like armor. She was Sloane Marchetti, a woman both respected and feared throughout Chicago, though Alara still had no idea who she was. Sloane approached the reception desk and asked the rigid employee behind it something in a voice so quiet Alara could barely hear her. Then her gaze moved slowly down the corridor, cold and sharp as tempered steel, until it came to rest on the small woman still dressed in a stained waitress uniform, standing frozen in the middle of the hallway. Sloane walked toward her with measured steps that carried an unmistakable weight, and within seconds, the two broad-shouldered women accompanying her shifted silently into position, standing at angles behind Alara like a living wall closing around her in a wordless circle. Alara felt the change immediately. The sensation of being surrounded by those massive bodies and their searching eyes sent a chill down her spine. But she forced herself to stand straight and refused to let them see how wildly her heart was beating. Sloane stopped about an arm's length away and looked her over from head to toe with dark, emotionless eyes, as though reading every detail, from her wet brown hair clinging to her face to the stained waitress uniform covering her body. "Who are you?" Sloane asked, her voice so low and quiet that Alara had to strain to hear her. Yet that very softness was more frightening than any shout could have been. "Why are you here? Why were you the one to bring my sister to this hospital? What did you do to her?" Every word carried cold suspicion, the vigilance of an alpha accustomed to finding betrayal everywhere she looked. Beneath it lay an anger restrained so tightly it had become dangerous. Alara swallowed hard. In that moment, she understood that if she showed fear, if she hesitated or tried to avoid the questions, this woman would crush her without a second thought. But she was too tired. Too exhausted after the long night. And she had nothing to hide. So instead of trembling, she lifted her chin, looked straight into those cold eyes, and answered with a calmness that surprised even her. "My name is Alara Vance. I'm a waitress at the restaurant where this happened. I don't know her. I didn't know who she was. And I don't know who you are." She paused. "I saw a pregnant woman in danger, so I brought her here. If you're looking for the person who hurt her, then you're looking at the wrong woman." The directness of her answer, with no hesitation, no attempt to soften the truth, seemed to make Sloane pause for the briefest moment. She was accustomed to people lowering their heads in front of her. Accustomed to eyes that darted away, voices that stammered with fear, the obedience her power always brought. But this small omega in a wrinkled uniform looked directly at her without blinking. Her voice didn't tremble, and in her tired gray eyes there was none of the fear Sloane usually saw, only honest exhaustion and a trace of stubbornness she couldn't understand. It made Sloane study her more carefully and for longer than before, as though trying to understand what kind of woman she was. "Could you tell your people to step back?" Ilara continued when Sloane remained silent. "I just drove halfway across the city through the rain to save your sister, and I truly don't have the strength to be surrounded like a criminal. If you don't believe me, ask the doctor. Check the cameras. Do whatever you want. But I've already told you the truth." A heavy silence passed between them. In that moment, something difficult to name flickered in Sloane's eyes, not trust, not yet, but a new kind of attention. A curiosity she hadn't felt in a very long time. Just then, the door to the treatment area behind them opened, and a nurse stepped out to say that the patient was awake and asking for the woman who had saved her. Sloane immediately turned and strode inside. After a moment's hesitation, Ilara followed. Isabella lay pale and weak in the hospital bed, but when her eyes found Ilara, a fragile smile appeared on her face. She reached out with a trembling hand and said in a faint, broken voice that this was the woman who had saved her, that without her, she and the baby wouldn't still be alive, that Ilara had stepped forward while everyone else had only stood and watched. Sloane stood silently beside her sister's bed and listened to every word. Then she slowly turned her head and looked at Ilara again. This time, her expression was completely different. The cold suspicion from before was gone, replaced by something very rare in a woman like her, a quiet respect, mingled with a gratitude she didn't yet know how to express. That night, after leaving the hospital with a promise that her people would remain stationed outside her sister's room until morning, Sloane Marchetti returned to her penthouse on the highest floor of a glass tower in the heart of Chicago. Beyond the windows stretching from floor to ceiling, the entire city spread beneath her like a vast tapestry woven from millions of points of light, streets threaded with streams of headlights reaching all the way to the horizon, the dark river bending through the city and reflecting the glow of the towers above it. This was the city whose every hidden corner of power she'd spent nearly her entire life learning to enter. A place where one phone call from her could set invisible machinery into motion, force locked doors to open, and make people, ordinary citizens would never meet, suddenly willing to listen to every word she said. But that night, standing before the familiar view, Sloane felt none of the satisfaction of a woman who ruled. Instead, a cold and steady anger burned quietly inside her chest, the anger of an alpha who'd just realized that the only family she had left had nearly died in the very city she believed she controlled completely. She poured herself a glass of whiskey but didn't drink it. She left it untouched on the stone table and began to think, slowly and sharply, about the question that kept piercing her mind like a thorn. How could this have happened without her knowing? She picked up her phone and called the woman she trusted most, a beta named Frankie who'd served her for years and understood every corner of her network better than anyone else. In only a few brief sentences, Sloane ordered Frankie to uncover everything connected to Isabella's wife, a woman named Chloe Whitmore, and she wanted to know it all, from the money Chloe spent and the places she frequented, to every person she associated with. But what truly stunned Sloane came from another detail. Frankie reported hesitantly later that night that rumors had been circulating. Isabella had occasionally appeared with bruises she'd tried clumsily to conceal, and at least one person within Sloane's own inner circle had heard whispers about it months earlier but had chosen to remain silent. When Sloane heard that, she set the phone down very gently. For one moment, the vast room sank into a silence so complete it was unnerving. To her, there was no greater offense than betrayal through silence. Nothing enraged her more than knowing that someone beneath her command had been aware that her sister was being hurt and had still chosen to look away, to protect themselves. She didn't shout, break anything, or reveal even the slightest outward sign of the fury turning inside her. That was what made Sloane Marchetti truly frightening. because her anger never flared like fire, it hardened into ice. The next morning, she summoned the woman who'd remained silent to a private room inside a building she owned. The conversation between them was brief, quiet, and unheard by anyone outside. People knew only that after that morning, the woman's name was never mentioned again in any conversation within their world, and she herself quietly vanished from Chicago. There was no disturbance, no spectacle. Only an empty space where a person had once been. And that silence said everything about the price of betraying the trust of an alpha like Sloane. Yet beneath the cold steel exterior of the most powerful woman in the city, there was something none of them could see. The image of the small Omega in the waitress uniform kept returning to her mind. A stranger who dared to do what her entire network of power had failed to do, protect her sister when she needed it most. The next morning, Alara returned to the hospital. She couldn't quite explain to herself why she'd done it. She told herself she only wanted to make certain the woman was all right, that it was what any decent person with a conscience would do. But deep inside, some invisible thread kept drawing her back to this place, back to the side of the stranger she'd risked herself to save in the rain the night before. She carried a small bouquet she'd bought in haste from a stand in the lobby, inexpensive flowers that still made her hesitate before spending the little tip money she'd earned during her previous shift, and walked along the upper floor corridor in search of Isabella's room. When she reached the partially open door, she lifted a hand to knock, but stopped when the scene inside made her unwilling to disturb the silence. Through the narrow opening, she saw Sloane Marchetti sitting beside her sister's hospital bed. She looked nothing like the cold, commanding woman Alara had met the night before. Sloane was leaning forward, elbows resting on her knees, hands clasped together. She was holding Isabella's sleeping hand with a tenderness so unexpected it was almost difficult to believe, as though she feared that even the slightest pressure might cause her pain. Her broad shoulders, always carrying authority with such rigid certainty, were now bowed beneath some invisible burden. And on her face, the face that seemed incapable of revealing emotion, Alara caught a glimpse of something she'd never imagined she'd see in a woman like her. Helplessness. Standing silently outside the door, Alara had no way of knowing that in that moment, Sloane's thoughts were drifting back toward a distant part of her life she'd always tried to bury. She remembered the fateful night many years earlier when she'd been only 19 and Isabella had still been a little girl. She remembered the telephone ringing in the middle of the night, the cold voice telling her that their parents had died in an accident she'd later understand had never been an accident at all. She remembered the ground seeming to collapse beneath her feet when she realized that from that moment on, she was alone in the world with a small sister who needed her to protect. She'd cast aside her youth, cast aside all the dreams a 19-year-old should have been allowed to possess, and thrown herself into a dark and merciless world, doing things she'd never speak of again, so that she could gain enough strength and power to shield her little sister from the world that had taken their parents away. She'd built an empire, made an entire city fear her name, and told herself that everything she'd done was so no one would ever be able to touch the person she loved again. And yet now, sitting beside that hospital bed, looking at Isabella's pale face and thinking of the wounds she'd silently endured for so long beneath the roof of her own home, Sloane suddenly faced a truth so bitter it left her numb. All the power she'd built, all the wealth and influence that made the city afraid of her, all the networks and people within her reach, they'd meant nothing when the danger had come from inside her sister's own home, from the very woman she'd trusted enough to give her to. She could buy almost anything in the world. She could make her enemies tremble with a single nod. But she hadn't been able to buy safety for the only person left in the world whom she truly loved. That helplessness tormented her more deeply than any physical wound ever could. Outside the door, Alara quietly stepped back, suddenly feeling as though she were intruding upon a moment far too private, a pain the woman inside had never intended anyone to witness. And somewhere within her, the way she saw Sloane Marchetti began to change. Because for the first time, she understood that behind the cold shell of steel was still a human being, a woman carrying a wound no different from the wounds she herself had always kept hidden. It took several more days before Isabella was strong enough to sit up in her hospital bed and speak clearly. Throughout those days, Sloane scarcely left the hospital, while Alara continued to stop by whenever her shift ended, sometimes bringing a box of fruit, sometimes only a few simple words of concern. Little by little, a strange closeness began to form among the three people who'd once been complete strangers. A bond none of them tried to name. And it was within that fragile warmth, one afternoon as pale sunlight spilled through the hospital window, that Isabella finally chose to break the silence she'd carried for so many years. She took her sister's hand, and in a quiet voice that no longer trembled as it once had, she began to reveal the truth she'd buried. She said that what happened in the parking lot that night hadn't been the first time. That for the past 2 years, beginning in the earliest months of her marriage, she'd lived inside a fear she hadn't dared confess to anyone. She explained that Chloe hadn't always been that way, that there were periods when she was so tender and attentive Isabella believed herself to be the happiest woman alive. But then her rages would descend without warning like sudden storms, and after each one she would fall to her knees, apologize, weep, and promise she would change, making Isabella soften and forgive her again and again. Sloane sat in silence and listened without interrupting her sister even once. But from where she stood in the corner of the room, Alara could see the veins rising across Sloane's hand as her grip tightened around the edge of the bed. Isabella went on, her voice catching when she reached the most painful truth of all, the reason she'd remained silent for so long. She said Chloe understood exactly what kind of woman her sister was, understood that Sloane possessed enough power and enough ruthlessness to make her disappear from the world with nothing more than a nod. And she'd used that knowledge to control Isabella. Chloe told her that if she ever revealed even a single word to her sister, Sloane would surely kill her, and then she'd become the widow of a murdered woman, her child would grow up without a mother, and her own sister would stain her hands with blood and might pay for it with her freedom. She'd planted that fear inside Isabella's mind with careful cruelty, turning her love for her sister into the very chain that kept her bound in silence, convincing her that hiding the truth was the only way to protect the people she loved. She also said that Chloe was calculating in a way that chilled her, always careful never to leave marks where anyone might see them, and whenever she knew Isabella would be meeting her sister or appearing in public, she'd cover herself in long sleeves, rehearse smiles, and perfect the appearance of a happy wife. A fragile mask that concealed everything beneath it. She'd played that role perfectly each time Sloane visited. She'd laughed, spoken about plans for the future, embraced her sister, and assured her that she was living well, while inside, she was breaking apart a little more each day. It was because of Chloe's ruthless cunning, and also because Sloane had wanted so badly to believe that her sister was happy that she'd never examined her life too closely, that this terrible truth had remained hidden from one of the most powerful and perceptive women in the city for all those years. When Isabella finished, the entire room sank into a heavy silence broken only by her quiet sobs. Sloane remained motionless. Her face didn't twitch, not a single muscle moved, but her hand had closed into a fist so tight that her knuckles had turned white. In her dark eyes, Alara saw an anger that didn't erupt into flame but settled into something far more frightening, a coldness like ice, a deadly stillness that revealed the woman had already made some decision within herself. And that anyone who'd ever caused her sister to shed a tear would soon learn the true price of those tears. After the afternoon when Isabella revealed the truth, one thought clung to Sloane's mind and refused to let go. It wasn't the image of the woman who'd harmed her sister, but the small Omega in the waitress uniform who'd stood quietly in the corner of the room throughout that long afternoon. She couldn't understand why a stranger, someone who didn't know Isabella, who owed her nothing, had been willing to throw herself into danger to save a woman she'd never even met, while so many others had merely watched and turned away. For an alpha accustomed to viewing the world through the lens of profit and calculation, Elara's actions existed beyond all reason. And it was precisely that mystery that made Sloane want to discover who this woman truly was. So she picked up the phone and called Frankie again. But this time, it wasn't to hunt down an enemy, it was to learn about the woman to whom her family owed a debt. She instructed Frankie to uncover everything about Elara Vance, not because she intended to harm her, but simply because she needed to understand the person who'd entered her family's life so unexpectedly. Within a single day, Frankie brought her a thin file. As Sloane sat alone in her penthouse reading each line, she gradually felt something tightening inside her chest. What she found wasn't the story of an Omega whose life had been easy and abundant, someone who could afford to give kindness away because she'd more than enough. It was the exact opposite. Elara Vance was 28 years old, a single mother raising her child alone in the heart of one of the most expensive cities in the country. Years earlier, while she was still pregnant, the alpha she'd trusted and given her life to had abandoned her. She hadn't merely left, she'd taken every dollar of the small savings they'd built together and vanished without a word, leaving Elara pregnant, penniless, and burdened with a debt she hadn't even known existed. She'd given birth alone, raised her child alone, and taught herself how to remain standing on her own 2 feet in a world that had never shown her much kindness. But what truly left Sloane silent was written in the next section of the file. Elara's young daughter, a little girl not yet 6 years old named Nora, suffered from an illness that required regular treatment and constant monitoring, and those recurring treatments consumed nearly everything the young mother earned. It was the reason Elara worked herself to exhaustion through 2 shifts every day, the reason she always appeared worn beyond her years, the reason she seemed to carry an invisible weight upon her shoulders wherever she went. She was drowning beneath mounting hospital expenses and bills she struggled to manage month after month, living at the very edge of collapse, both physically and financially. Yet this was the Omega who, while fighting for every dollar needed to care for her sick child, while living a life that had never once spared her, hadn't hesitated to drop her car keys onto the ground and rush to save a stranger in the rain. She'd used her own aging car and the little gas money she possessed to carry Sloane's sister to the hospital. Sloane placed the file on the stone table and for a long time simply sat there in silence, staring through the glass windows as the city lights began to glow below. She'd spent her entire life in a world where every action carried a price, where kindness always concealed an intention, where no one gave anything without expecting something in return. She'd grown accustomed to believing that people were generous only when they'd more than they needed, and kind only when kindness cost them nothing. Yet before her now was an Omega who'd given the greatest kindness one human being could offer, the willingness to risk her own safety, not from abundance, but from the deepest place within a life shaped by loss and deprivation. Elara had nothing. She had no money, no power, no one standing behind her. And even from the bottom of that abyss, she'd still chosen to step forward. It forced Sloane, a woman who believed she'd already seen every dark corner of the human heart, to reconsider everything she'd ever believed about the world. A few days later, when Elara had just finished her evening shift and stepped out through the restaurant's back door, she was surprised to find Sloane Marchetti waiting beside her black car, her tall figure casting a shadow beneath the streetlight. She hadn't brought the broad-shouldered women who'd accompanied her the first time they met. She stood there alone, and that eased some of Elara's tension, though the familiar caution inside her still rose at once. Sloane told her that she'd come to thank her properly, because what she'd done for her sister was something she could never forget, and because she was the kind of woman who always repaid what she owed. Then she drew a thick envelope from inside her coat, held it out, and said this was how she wished to express her gratitude, that the money inside was enough to cover every hardship she was facing, Enough to free her from working herself to exhaustion through 2 shifts every day. Ilara looked at the envelope in Sloane's hand. For one brief moment, she understood that the money could change her entire life, could erase the debts that were strangling her, could pay for the treatments her daughter needed and that she was still struggling to afford. But she understood something else as well. Something deeper. If she accepted that envelope, then what she'd done on that rainy night would no longer remain what it had truly been. She shook her head, and in a calm but unwavering voice, she told Sloane she couldn't accept the money. She said she hadn't saved her sister in order to be rewarded, she'd done it because it was the right thing to do, and if she accepted the money now, she'd be turning her actions into a transaction. Kindness wasn't something that could be bought or sold. Sloane stared at her as though she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Because in all her life, no one had ever refused her money. No one had ever stood before such a large sum and calmly shaken their head. She told Ilara that she knew about her circumstances, about her debts, about her daughter, and that she couldn't understand why she'd reject something that could release her from every burden she carried. Ilara pressed her lips together when she heard Sloane mention the private details of her life, then answered that yes, her life was difficult, more difficult than Sloane could imagine. But she'd carried it alone for years and would continue carrying it alone, because her self-respect was the only thing life hadn't taken from her, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. A long silence stretched between them after those words. And then the conversation turned in another direction when Sloane, the coldness returning to her face, said that whether Ilara took the money or not no longer mattered. What truly concerned her now was making the woman who'd harmed her sister pay, and she had her own way of ensuring that Chloe would never be able to hurt anyone again. The quiet, icy way she said it made Ilara shiver, because she immediately understood what Sloane meant. To her own surprise, she heard herself objecting fiercely. She told Sloane she couldn't do that, that if she chose that path, she'd lower herself to the same level as the very woman she despised, that violence only gave birth to more violence and would never end the cycle. She said Isabella and her unborn child deserved a future unstained by blood and guilt, and that if Sloane truly wanted to protect her sister, what she needed wasn't a sister burdened with more sin, but real justice, justice carried out openly and lawfully. Sloane looked at her, an irritation mixed with surprise flickering through her dark eyes, because no one had ever dared lecture her about right and wrong, and no one had ever challenged the way she chose to protect those she loved. The two of them stood beneath the streetlight, belonging to worlds that couldn't have been more different, one a powerful crime boss accustomed to living by her own rules, the other a poor Omega who still held firmly to her faith in what was right. A chasm between them that seemed impossible to cross. And yet, strangely, it was in that heated clash that some invisible thread quietly began to connect them, because each recognized in the other a strength of will and a depth of heart that couldn't be dismissed. When Sloane climbed into her car and drove away that night, she knew the Omega's words would follow her for a very long time. Frankie came to see Sloane early one morning, and from the moment the loyal Beta entered the room with an unusually tense expression, Sloane knew that whatever she was about to say was no small matter. Frankie placed a file on the table, much thicker than the one she'd brought before, and explained that while digging deeper into Chloe Whitmore's life on Sloane's orders, she'd uncovered something none of them had expected. Something hidden beneath the surface of what had seemed to be an ordinary abusive wife. Sloane sat down, opened the file, and as she turned through the pages one by one, her usually composed face gradually became frighteningly cold. What lay before her wasn't merely the trail of a woman who beat her wife, but evidence of a betrayal calculated down to the smallest detail. Chloe Whitmore hadn't entered Isabella's life by chance, and her marriage to Sloane's sister had never been the love story everyone believed it to be. The words in the file painted a picture that seemed to freeze the blood in Sloane's veins. From the very beginning, Chloe had known exactly who Sloane Marchetti was and what she controlled within the city. She wasn't simply the real estate businesswoman her polished appearance suggested, she was a deliberately planted piece on a larger board. And the hand moving that piece belonged to a rival organization that had long hungered to bring down the empire Sloane had built. Marriage to Isabella, from their first date to the day of the wedding, had all been a move planned with chilling precision. Chloe had approached her sister and used charm and tender words to capture her heart, not because she loved her, but because she wanted to work her way into Sloane's innermost circle, to become family, so she could gain access to secrets, business dealings, and vulnerabilities no outsider could ever reach. For the past 2 years, while Sloane believed her sister had found a loving home, her most dangerous enemy had in fact been sitting at her family table, smiling at her, shaking her hand, and quietly collecting every fragment of information she could one day use against her. The more Sloane read, the more she understood that the beatings Chloe had inflicted on Isabella weren't simply the outbursts of a violent alpha who'd lost control, they'd also been tools of domination and manipulation, a way to keep her trapped in fear and silence, to make certain she'd never dare reveal anything that might destroy her plan. She'd exploited the love Isabella felt for her sister and turned it into a chain, calculating everything with a cruelty so cold it was almost inhuman. What enraged Sloane most wasn't that Chloe had dared to conspire against her empire, because in Sloane's world, schemes like that had never been unusual. What she couldn't forgive was that Chloe had used her sister, the only innocent person in all these filthy calculations, as a pawn in her game, forcing a trusting and gentle Omega to pay with years of suffering simply because she had a sister other alphas wanted to destroy. Sloane closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. Within that stillness, she felt more clearly than ever the bitterness of a woman who'd just realized that the fortress she'd spent her life building to protect someone she loved had been breached from within by the very hand she'd trusted enough to welcome into her home. She devoted her entire life to guarding against dangers from the outside, raising layer after layer of defense so no enemy could ever reach Isabella. Yet the most dangerous enemy had been the woman Sloane herself had invited through the door, granted the place of family, and trusted enough to give her sister to in marriage. The guilt tormented her even more than the anger, because she understood that her own complacency, her blind belief that her sister was happy, had kept her from seeing the truth that had been directly in front of her all along. But now that every mask had fallen and Chloe Whitmore's true face had been fully exposed, Sloane knew the game had entered a new stage. And this time, she'd be the one holding the advantage. No one understood how Chloe had managed to discover where Isabella was staying after leaving the hospital, a secure apartment Sloane had arranged for her sister, but one afternoon, just as the guards were changing shifts, she found a way inside and appeared before her. This time, however, she didn't arrive with her usual rage or threatening expression. Instead, the moment Isabella saw her and recoiled in fear, Chloe immediately dropped to her knees on the floor in front of her and began performing the same scene Isabella had witnessed more times than she could count throughout their 2 years of marriage. She looked up with reddened eyes as though struggling to hold back tears, and her voice broke with emotion as she said she knew she'd been wrong, that she hated herself for what she'd done, that she hadn't been herself that night. She said some kind of demon had taken control of her, and ever since Isabella left, she'd been living in a hell of guilt and regret, unable to eat or sleep, longing only for one chance to make amends. Chloe continued her performance with the practiced skill she'd refined over the years, touching precisely the emotional chords she knew best within her young wife's heart. She reminded her of the beautiful memories from the beginning, the days when Isabella had believed herself to be the happiest woman alive, and asked how she could possibly throw all of that away, how she could allow their child to be born without a mother beside them. She said she'd found a therapist, that this time she truly would change, not with empty promises but with a genuine transformation from the deepest part of her heart. She reached out and lightly touched Isabella's trembling hand, and in the gentlest voice she could produce, she whispered that she loved her more than anything in the world, that without her her life had no meaning, and that she was begging for one final chance. And Isabella, a gentle, trusting Omega with a heart that had always longed to believe in goodness, felt herself wavering once again beneath those sweet words. She looked down at the woman kneeling before her, the woman she'd once loved so deeply, the mother of the child moving inside her. In that moment, all the pain she'd caused seemed to fade beneath her tears and solemn promises. A part of her, the fragile part that had led her to forgive so many times before, began whispering the same familiar words once again, that perhaps this time she was telling the truth, that perhaps people really could change, that a child needed both mothers, that she couldn't carry everything alone. She thought about the uncertain future ahead, about the loneliness of becoming a single mother, about the way other people might look at her. Little by little, those fears began to drown out the voice of reason. Her lips trembled, and she felt her head beginning to lower in an unconscious nod, as though her tender heart were winning once more, as though she were preparing to step back into the same vicious cycle that had imprisoned her for years. At the very moment Isabella's lips were about to speak the fateful words of forgiveness, the apartment door flew open and Alara stepped inside with one of the guards who'd just discovered Chloe's presence. With a single glance, Alara understood exactly what was happening, the Alpha kneeling on the floor with tears covering her face, the Omega wavering on the edge of surrender, the suffocating atmosphere of a performance she'd once watched destroy another life. Chloe was forced to leave under the guard's escort. Before she disappeared behind the door, the look she cast at Alara was filled with cold hatred. When only the two women remained in the room, Alara walked over and sat beside Isabella, who was still trembling and confused, her eyes wet from the tender words she'd just heard. Alara took her hand, and she understood that this was a moment when she couldn't remain silent. This was the time to do something she'd never done with anyone in all the years of her life, to open the door leading into the most painful part of her past. She gently touched the old silver bracelet around her wrist, a cheap piece of jewelry that had darkened with age but that she'd never once removed, and in a quiet, somber voice, she began telling Isabella the story she'd buried inside herself for her entire life. She explained that when she was a child, she'd grown up in a home where fear was always present, where her mother, the gentlest and kindest Omega she'd ever known, lived beneath the hand of an Alpha whose rage could erupt at any moment. She said her mother had forgiven her too, time after time, had believed her apologies and tears, had convinced herself she had to endure and give her one more chance for the sake of her child, for the sake of their family, for the future she'd always dreamed of. And with every forgiveness, her mother had bound herself more tightly to a vicious cycle with no escape, persuading herself again and again that next time would be different. Alara's voice caught when she reached the end of the story. There'd come one fateful night when the violence left her mother no chance to forgive again. And what had haunted Alara throughout her life wasn't only the loss itself, but the knowledge that people had been close enough to hear, close enough to know, and yet not one of them had dared to step forward. No one had knocked on the door. Every one of them had chosen to turn away and pretend that nothing was happening. Tears streamed down Isabella's face as she listened, and Alara tightened her hold on her hand, telling her that because she'd watched that silence take her mother's life, she could never stand by and watch another Omega walk down the same road. She told Isabella that the feeling that kept making her forgive, that kept softening her heart whenever Chloe cried, wasn't love, it was a carefully constructed trap that used her own kindness and compassion to imprison her. Someone who truly loved another person would never force them to live in fear, would never use pain as a means of control. Promises of change repeated after every act of cruelty were nothing more than links in the chain holding her captive. Alara looked directly into Isabella's tear-filled eyes and said she understood the fear of being alone, understood the belief that a child needed both mothers. But a child raised in a home filled with fear and tears would carry wounds far deeper than a child raised in peace by one strong mother. She said she'd been that child, and she knew the price all too well. Those words, spoken from the deepest place of genuine pain, reached something inside Isabella that no one had ever touched before. She sat in silence for a long time, her tears still falling, but her eyes gradually began to change, shifting from confusion and uncertainty into a clarity she'd never possessed. She placed a hand over her stomach where her little child was growing with each passing day, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt strength rising from within her, a determination that came from no one else but herself. She lifted her head and looked at Alara, and in a voice that still trembled but now carried a new steadiness, she said she wouldn't remain silent any longer. She'd stand up and tell the whole truth, not only for herself, but for her child, and for every other Omega who'd suffered or was still suffering in the darkness. It was the moment when Isabella, for the first time in her life, made a decision about her own future. A few days later, with a new determination beginning to take root inside her, Isabella did something she'd never have dared imagine only a short time before. She walked into a police station of her own free will and reported the entire truth. Alara went with her, sitting beside her throughout the drive and taking her hand whenever she hesitated. That quiet presence gave Isabella the courage she needed. The officer assigned to the case was a female alpha detective named Bishop, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes that still held a deep sense of compassion, someone who'd spent many years standing beside victims who'd no voice of their own. She listened to Isabella with patience and without judgment, and under her gentle guidance, Isabella told her everything, hiding nothing. She spoke about 2 years spent living in fear, about the times Chloe hurt her and then soothed her with empty promises, about the way she'd used the love Isabella felt for her sister to control and silence her. Every truth she spoke seemed to lift part of the burden that had weighed on her shoulders for so many years. Though her voice sometimes caught with emotion, she continued until the end, because this time she understood that her silence had never protected anyone, it had only fed the darkness. Detective Bishop carefully recorded every detail, and when Isabella finished, she explained that her statement was extremely important, but to charge an alpha like Chloe Whitmore, an alpha with money and connections that could help her slip through the cracks in the law, they'd need additional witnesses, people who'd seen her actions with their own eyes. That was when Alara spoke. She said she'd been there in the parking lot that night, that she'd witnessed exactly what Chloe had done to her wife, and that she was willing to come forward as a witness and testify to everything she'd seen. Detective Bishop looked at her with both gratitude and seriousness, then warned Alara that standing as a witness against someone like Chloe wouldn't be simple, that it could bring danger and trouble into her own life. Alara understood that clearly. She knew that in her circumstances, as a single mother struggling to care for a sick child, she'd too much to lose and too little with which to protect herself. But she also understood that if she stepped back now, if she chose her own safety and turned away, then she'd be no different from the people who'd remained silent on the night her mother needed them most. That was something she could never forgive herself for. So without hesitation, she affirmed her decision and accepted whatever risks might come. With Isabella's statement, Alara's testimony, and the evidence Detective Bishop quickly gathered, the machinery of the law began to move. Only a few days later, a court order was delivered directly into Chloe Whitmore's hands, officially beginning legal proceedings against her. It was the first time in her life that she'd been forced to face consequences for the things she'd always believed she could hide forever, the first time she realized that the perfect facade she'd worked so hard to create was beginning to crack. When she learned that Alara was the one who'd stepped forward as a witness, the poor Omega she'd once treated with contempt, the woman who'd dared interfere in her affairs from the very beginning on that fateful night, the anger inside her hardened into something deeper and far more dangerous. In her eyes, Alara was no longer merely a troublesome outsider. She'd become a direct threat, someone capable of destroying her entire plan and future. Her cold attention now turned fully toward Alara, and a dark intention began to form in her mind, because she was not the kind of alpha who'd ever sit quietly and accept defeat. she'd do whatever it took to silence the Omega who dared stand against her. Chloe's hatred refused to remain still, and not long after receiving the court order, she found a way to intercept Alara one evening, just as she finished her shift and stepped into the area behind the restaurant. She didn't lay a hand on her, because she was clever enough to know that doing so now would only add more charges against her. But the weapon she chose was even crueler than her fists. She used words. She approached Alara with a cold smile on her lips, and in a voice so gentle it was chilling, she told her she should think very carefully about what she was doing. She said she knew Alara was a mother, knew she had a little girl she loved more than her own life, and that a wise mother always understood that her child's safety had to come before everything else. She never made a single direct threat. But the way she mentioned Alara's daughter, the meaning in her eyes, was enough to plant an icy terror deep inside Alara's heart. Chloe quietly told her that the world was a dangerous place, that unfortunate things could happen to anyone, and that she could easily spare herself and the people she loved from every kind of trouble simply by withdrawing her statement and remaining silent, as she should have done from the beginning. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Alara frozen in the empty lot, cold spreading through her entire body. That night, after returning home and quietly looking into the room where her little daughter slept peacefully under the care of their kind neighbor, Alara gently closed the door and stepped outside. She didn't want her child to wake and see her like this. She drove back to the parking lot behind the restaurant, the place where everything had begun, and sat alone inside her old car in the darkness and silence of the night. There, when no one could see her, when she no longer had to force herself to appear strong for anyone, Alara finally allowed the tears she'd held back for so long to break free. She cried as she'd never permitted herself to cry before, because the weight of everything pressed together had become too much for her to carry alone. She thought about the shifts that stretched on until she could barely stand, about the mountain of debts that seemed impossible to repay, about her daughter's treatments and the constant fear that she wouldn't be able to afford them. And now, added to all those burdens, was the most terrible fear any mother could know, the fear that her own courage might bring danger upon the child she loved more than anything in the world. In that moment of weakness, a thought slipped into her mind and whispered that perhaps she should stop. Perhaps she should step away. Perhaps protecting her daughter mattered more than every principle of right and wrong in the world. She asked herself why she always had to be the one who endured, why life kept placing one burden after another upon her shoulders, why she couldn't simply turn away and live a quiet life like everyone else. She felt utterly small and alone, an Omega with no money, no power, and no one truly standing behind her, facing an Alpha who seemed to possess everything she needed to crush her. But then, in the darkness of the car, her trembling fingers unconsciously found the old silver bracelet around her wrist. When she touched the cold, smooth metal, something inside her began to settle. The bracelet was the only keepsake she'd left from her mother, the Omega who died because everyone around her had chosen silence. And as Alara traced its familiar contours with her fingertips, she could almost hear her mother's voice reaching her from the past. Alara closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, and little by little, her tears stopped falling. She understood that if she stepped back now, if she allowed fear to defeat her, she wouldn't only be betraying Isabella and herself, she'd also be betraying the memory of the mother she'd lost, and she'd be teaching her daughter that when faced with evil, a person could turn away and run. That wasn't the lesson she wanted to leave behind for her child. She thought of Nora, of her clear eyes and her smile, and she understood that the best way to protect her daughter wasn't to teach her to bow before fear, but to become an example of courage that her child could one day follow. With that thought, Alara opened her eyes, wiped the last tears from her face, and sat upright in the car. The fear was still there, it hadn't disappeared, but it no longer had the power to defeat her. She'd reached the very bottom of despair and exhaustion, and from that lowest place, she'd found the strength to rise once again, more determined than ever that she wouldn't retreat. The next morning, when Alara arrived at the hospital for her daughter's regularly scheduled treatment, something unexpected was waiting for her at the billing desk. The employee looked at the records on the screen, then raised her eyes and told Alara that every outstanding medical bill connected to her daughter had been paid in full. Not only that, but all the treatments scheduled for the months ahead had already been covered as well. Alara stood frozen, certain there had to be some kind of mistake, because she knew exactly how much she still owed, a sum so overwhelming that whenever she thought about it at night, sleep became impossible. She asked again and again, insisting that the employee check everything carefully, but the answer remained the same. Someone had quietly taken upon themselves the entire financial burden that had weighed on her shoulders for so many years. Someone had silently loosened the knot that had been tightening around her life, without leaving a name or asking for anything in return. While she was still struggling to comprehend it, she suddenly noticed another detail, something she'd vaguely sensed during the past several days but hadn't dared believe. Whenever her daughter went to school or when the little girl was taken to the park by their kind neighbor, there always seemed to be a quiet presence somewhere in the distance, a discreet figure watching from a safe distance, an unseen protection of which the child remained completely unaware as she continued to laugh and play in perfect peace. Alara followed the few clues she had, and when the truth finally emerged, she could hardly believe what she'd discovered. The person who'd quietly paid every one of her debts, the person who'd secretly assigned women to watch over her daughter and make certain she was always safe, was none other than Sloane Marchetti. What stunned her even more was the realization that Sloane's silent protection hadn't begun only after Chloe threatened her, it had started much earlier, on the very first rainy night when she brought Isabella to the hospital. From the moment Sloane investigated her circumstances and learned about the burdens she'd been carrying alone, she'd quietly intervened, not with the envelope Alara had proudly refused, but in a way so discreet that she couldn't reject it, because she hadn't even known it was happening. Sloane had respected her dignity, exactly as she'd asked her to. But at the same time, in her own quiet way, she'd continued to watch over and protect both her and her child. When Alara understood everything, a powerful rush of emotion rose inside her, something she couldn't find a name for. For so many years, she'd believed she was entirely alone in the world, that she had to carry every burden herself because no one was truly standing behind her. That belief had become part of who she was, a hard shell she'd wrapped around herself in order to survive. Yet now she realized that throughout the time when she'd felt most alone and desperate, even on the night when she'd sat crying by herself in the parking lot and believed the whole world had turned its back on her, someone had actually been standing quietly behind her all along, supporting her without asking for thanks or expecting anything in return. After so many years of struggling alone, the feeling of being protected by someone made her heart seem to break into pieces, not from pain, but from a gentle, overwhelming emotion that tightened her throat. She thought of Sloane, of the cold and commanding alpha she'd first met at the hospital, of the moment when she'd accidentally seen her sitting helplessly beside her sister's bed, and of the fierce argument they'd shared beneath the streetlight. She realized that behind that shell of steel was a woman capable of loving and protecting more deeply than anyone she'd ever known, an alpha who expressed what she felt not through beautiful words, but through quiet acts no one was meant to see. And in that moment, something inside Alara changed forever. The invisible thread that had first formed between them during their earlier clash now became clearer and warmer than ever before. For the first time in many years, after keeping her heart tightly closed in order to protect herself, Alara felt it begin to stir. A true and powerful feeling she could no longer deny for the alpha who'd silently become a source of strength for her and her daughter, even when she hadn't known she was there. Chloe wasn't the kind of alpha who accepted defeat easily, and when her veiled threats failed to make Alara retreat as she'd expected, she decided to make a more reckless and desperate move. Late one evening, just as Alara locked the restaurant's back door and stepped into the familiar lot, Chloe was already waiting for her. This time, she wasn't alone. Several hard-looking women lingered among the cars parked in the shadows, and the place that had once witnessed Alara's act of courage now became the stage for another confrontation. But this time, the air was thick with danger and dark intent. Chloe approached her, every trace of false politeness stripped away, revealing the cruelty beneath. She told Alara that she'd given her the chance to choose the easy path, but she'd been foolish enough to refuse. Now she'd force her to withdraw her testimony by whatever means necessary. Alara stepped back, her heart pounding as her hand searched for the phone inside her pocket, but one of the women blocked her path, closing her inside their circle. Fear surged through her, but she clenched her teeth and held her ground, determined not to let them see her trembling, even though she understood that the situation had become truly dangerous. What Chloe didn't know was that Sloane had been watching her every move for some time. Ever since uncovering Chloe's true conspiracy and learning that she'd threatened Alara, Sloane had ordered her people to quietly monitor everything Chloe did. The moment she and her women arrived at the parking lot, word was sent back immediately. Just as Chloe signaled for her people to move in and close around Alara, the sharp sound of tires skidding across the wet pavement cut through the night, and the familiar black vehicle sped into the lot, stopping across the exit. Sloane stepped out with her people, and in an instant, the balance of the confrontation shifted completely. She moved forward with a deadly calm, her eyes locked on Chloe with a coldness more terrifying than any display of rage. Chloe's women, though greater in number, began to hesitate when they realized who'd arrived, because in the city's underworld, the name Sloane Marchetti carried enough weight to make even the most reckless alphas think twice. Chloe, cornered and believing she'd nothing left to lose, lunged forward, and a struggle erupted among the women in the parking lot. Sloane's people quickly overpowered Chloe's, and amid the chaos, Sloane went straight for the alpha who'd harmed her sister. The two alphas collided, and though Chloe was far from weak, she was no match for someone like Sloane, an alpha driven not only by strength but by fury that had been restrained for far too long. Within moments, Sloane had her completely subdued, pinning her down and stripping her of every chance to resist. Chloe lay there, utterly helpless for the first time in her life, staring up into the face of the alpha holding her down. Genuine terror flashed in her eyes, because she understood that her fate now rested entirely in the hands of the woman she'd foolishly provoked. Sloane tightened her grip, and in that moment, all the anger, all the guilt, and every image of her sister suffering through 2 years of pain crashed through her mind at once. This was the alpha who'd deceived her entire family, used her innocent sister as a pawn, forced her to live in fear and tears, and threatened the Omega who'd saved her life. With the power and strength she possessed, Sloane could make this woman disappear from the world right then and there. No one could stop her. And part of her, the part that had spent years living by the ruthless laws of the underworld, screamed for her to do exactly that. To end everything once and for all. Her hand tightened further, her entire body drawn taut like a bow pulled to its limit. Chloe, sensing that her life hung upon that single moment, stopped struggling altogether. The entire parking lot seemed to fall into a deadly silence, every eye fixed on Sloane and the fragile line between justice and crime, between the woman she wanted to become and the woman her past had made her. It was in that merciless moment, when everything seemed poised to cross a line from which there could be no return, that Alara's voice tore through the deadly silence of the parking lot. She'd broken free from the circle around her and run toward them, and now she stood only a few steps away from Sloane, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice carrying an extraordinary steadiness. She called Sloane's name and begged her to stop. She told Sloane she understood the anger inside her, understood everything this woman had done to the people she loved, and knew that she possessed more than enough strength to end Chloe's life right then and there. But that was precisely why this was the most important moment of all, the moment that would decide what kind of woman she truly was. She told Sloane that if she did it, if she allowed her fury to guide her and struck down the woman beneath her, then with her own hands, she'd become the very thing she hated most. She'd no longer be any different from the woman lying at her feet, and the darkness she'd spent her whole life trying to protect her sister from would become the very darkness she herself spread into the world. Elara stepped closer, and her voice softened, though every word still carried an immense weight. She reminded Sloane of the niece or nephew who'd soon be born, the little child Isabella had nearly sacrificed her life to protect. She said that if she stained her hands with blood that night, the child would grow up beneath a dark shadow, carrying the truth that the aunt they loved had become a killer, and that stain would follow her entire family for the rest of their lives. She asked whether that was truly the gift she wanted to leave for an innocent child, whether that was how she wished to honor the memory of her parents, who'd also been taken from her by this very kind of violence. She told Sloane that true justice didn't lie in punishing Chloe with her own hands according to the laws of darkness, it lay in forcing her to face the consequences openly, allowing the entire world to see her true face, and making her live out the rest of her days amid the complete collapse of everything she'd once possessed. That, she said, would be the real victory, a victory that wouldn't cost Sloane her own soul. Her words cut through the armor Sloane had worn for so many years like blades, reaching something buried so deeply inside her that she'd almost forgotten it still existed. She remained there, breathing heavily, her hands still clenched, while the fiercest struggle she'd ever known unfolded inside her mind. On one side was the familiar call of a lifetime shaped by violence, the voice whispering that only death was fitting for an alpha who'd caused so much suffering, that it was the only way to make certain Chloe could never harm anyone again. But on the other side was the voice of the Omega standing before her, an Omega who'd shown her that kindness and righteousness could still exist even in a cruel world, who'd climbed out of the deepest pit of suffering and somehow preserved the purity of her soul. She looked down at Chloe lying helpless beneath her, then lifted her eyes to Elara and met her gaze. In Elara's eyes, she saw no judgment, she saw faith. A belief that she was a better woman than the world that had shaped her. Then slowly, Sloane loosened her hand. Her whole body, which had been drawn tight like a bowstring, gradually relaxed, and she rose to her feet, leaving Chloe gasping on the ground. She turned to her people and ordered them to hold Chloe securely, not so they could punish her according to the laws of darkness, but so they could hand her over to the authorities along with every piece of evidence Sloane had quietly gathered concerning all her crimes, from the abuse of her sister to the conspiracy against her, and every other unlawful act Chloe had committed. Sloane's power and network, instead of being used to end a woman's life, would now be used to ensure that Chloe couldn't manipulate the system or escape, that she'd be forced to face justice fully and completely. In that moment of letting go, Sloane Marchetti did something she'd never done before in her life. She chose justice over vengeance, she chose light over darkness. And that choice changed her forever, transforming her from a crime boss who'd known only the law of power into a woman who'd finally discovered a greater kind of strength, the strength of mercy and decency. A few weeks after that fateful night in the parking lot, while the legal proceedings were gradually being completed, Isabella gave birth to her child in a hospital filled with gentle light. Sloane waited outside the delivery room, and Elara held Isabella's hand tightly throughout the labor. The baby was born healthy, her strong cry ringing out with vibrant life, and when the tiny child was placed in Isabella's arms, all the pain and fear she'd endured for so many years seemed to dissolve, giving way to a happiness that was pure and complete. It was a little girl, and as Isabella looked into her daughter's tiny face, she understood that every brave choice she'd made, the decision to break her silence, the decision to stand up and fight, had all been worth it. Because now, her child would be born and raised in a world no longer shadowed by fear. Sloane entered the room, and the alpha who'd always been so cold and unyielding couldn't hide her tears when she held her little niece for the first time, feeling the fragile yet powerful life in her arms. The life that had come so close to being taken away on that rainy night. When the trial finally began, the entire family entered the courtroom with a completely different spirit. They were no longer frightened victims trembling in the darkness, but people who'd reclaimed their strength and their voices. The courtroom was packed, and the air was heavy with tension as each piece of evidence was brought into the light. Security footage from the parking lot on that fateful night was shown, allowing everyone to see clearly what had truly happened and what Alara had courageously done when she'd stepped forward instead of turning away. Isabella's testimony filled the courtroom, this time without the slightest trace of fear in her voice, as she revealed the entire truth about 2 years spent in suffering and the ways she'd been manipulated and controlled. Alara also took the stand, calmly and clearly recounting everything she'd witnessed with her own eyes. Most important of all, the evidence Sloane had quietly gathered was presented to the court, exposing not only Chloe's abuse but also her calculated schemes of fraud and betrayal, the entire dark game she'd constructed from the beginning. One by one, every layer of Chloe's disguise was stripped away before everyone in the room, and the alpha who'd once believed she could manipulate everything forever now sat with her head bowed, utterly broken. When the judge read the sentence, the entire courtroom fell silent. Chloe Whitmore was convicted of the full range of her crimes and given an appropriate prison sentence, long enough to ensure that she'd never again be able to harm anyone, and long enough to bring justice for all the suffering she'd caused. There were no cheers and no words of triumph in that moment, only a deep breath of relief that seemed to spread through the courtroom, as though an invisible weight that had pressed down on everyone for so long had finally been lifted. It wasn't a victory of revenge, but a victory of justice carried out openly and lawfully, just as Alara had always believed it should be, and just as Sloane had bravely chosen in that decisive moment in the parking lot. Amid it all, the sight that touched every heart in the courtroom was Isabella sitting in the front row, holding her little daughter tightly in her arms. She looked down at the angelic face of her sleeping child, who knew nothing of the storms her mother had endured in order to protect her, and in the young Omega's eyes there was a peace she hadn't known for a very long time. That child, born from adversity but raised in love and protection, was the clearest living symbol of a new beginning, of light overcoming darkness. Sloane placed a hand on her sister's shoulder, while Alara stood beside them, and the three people who'd once been strangers were now bound together by a journey that had changed all their lives. When they walked out of the courthouse together beneath the morning sunlight, a chapter filled with pain and turmoil finally came to an end, making way for the new pages still waiting ahead. Many months passed after the trial came to an end, and Alara's life entered an entirely new chapter. With the money she'd saved and the tireless effort she'd poured into her dream, she was finally able to open a small, welcoming restaurant on a quiet street corner, a place where she could prepare the food she loved with her own hands and greet every customer with a sincere smile. It was a dream she'd carried for years but had never truly believed she could reach. And now, it had become real, not because of the money she'd once proudly refused, but because of her own hard work and unbreakable will, along with Sloane's quiet and genuine support. Sloane had come to understand that what Alara needed wasn't charity or pity, but someone who truly believed in her and was willing to stand beside her, and that was exactly what she gave her. Between the two women who'd once belonged to completely different worlds, the bond born from gratitude on that rainy night slowly grew into something deeper and more lasting, a connection of understanding and respect that neither of them had ever found in anyone else. Sloane, who'd once known only power and coldness, learned from Alara what kindness truly meant. And Alara, who'd once kept her heart locked away to protect herself, learned that not every alpha was a shadow from her past, and that she could open herself to trust and love once more. On a bright and beautiful afternoon, their small family gathered in the courtyard behind Alara's restaurant. Clear laughter of the children rang beneath the warm golden sunlight. Alara's little daughter, now much healthier after receiving the full treatment she needed, her cheeks glowing pink and her smile shining like sunlight as she ran and played beside her baby cousin, Isabella's little girl resting safely in her mother's arms. Watching the two children play in such perfect peace filled the adults with a gentle happiness, because they understood that their courage and love had made that beautiful moment possible. Their story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that sometimes one brave step taken by an ordinary person is enough to bring light into the darkest place, that kindness given from the very depths of hardship is the noblest kindness of all, and that silence in the face of wrongdoing has never protected anyone. Only the courage to speak can break the cycles of suffering and open the way to a new beginning for everyone. As the afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the courtyard, Sloane turned to Alara and reached for her hand. Their fingers laced together with an ease that had once seemed impossible, two women from different worlds, brought together by one act of courage on a rainy night. "I never thanked you properly," Sloane said quietly, her dark eyes soft in a way that would have shocked anyone who knew her only as the city's most feared alpha. "For everything. For my sister. For my niece. For showing me there's another way." Alara squeezed her hand and smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached all the way to her tired gray eyes. "You don't have to thank me. You just had to be willing to see it." Sloane lifted their joined hands and pressed her lips to Alara's knuckles, a gesture so tender it made Alara's breath catch. "I see it now," she murmured against her skin. "I see you." Alara felt warmth bloom in her chest, spreading through her like sunlight after years of darkness. She reached up with her free hand and brushed a strand of dark hair from Sloane's face, letting her fingers linger against the alpha's sharp jawline. "Good," she whispered back. "Because I'm not going anywhere." And standing there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the laughter of children and the warmth of newfound family, the Alpha and the Omega who'd once been complete strangers understood that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings led to the most beautiful endings.